Welcome to the Authority File, the podcast where you'll hear conversations with academic librarians, technologists, researchers, and authors whose work is laying the foundation for higher education's future. I'm Bill Mickey, your host and the editorial director at Choice, and I'm excited to be speaking with Dr. Tanis McDonald. Tanis is an associate professor at Wilfrid Laurier University. She has her PhD in English with a specialization in Canadian literature. Her current research focuses on modernist and contemporary poetry. She's also the editor of the Laurier Poetry Series, part of Wilfrid Laurier University Press, and the author of several books, including her most recent, Straggle, Adventures in Walking While Female, a collection of essays about the importance of walking, being female while doing it, and the social commentary that emerges from it. Tanis is also a very active and vocal advocate for the study and support of contemporary Canadian poets. This four-part series is brought to you with support from Wilfrid Laurier University Press. In this second episode, we discuss some of the unique characteristics of Canadian poetry and the urgency in maintaining the instruction of it. Can you describe how locality and a sense of place play a role in poetry and literature? I'm wondering how this fits into sort of the Canadian, literary scene, I guess, and how does this sense of place in contemporary poetry contrast with that of, Canada's old regionality?
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned the old regionality because that used to be how Canadian Canadian literature was taught. Now we will do some prairie poetry, and now we're going to go to BC and read these stories about lumberjacks, right, etc. Right, fishing stories off the East Coast. Now, none of those things are bad things or
Right.
bad subjects, except when we decide to divide them up in what I call the old regionalisms. It suggests that that number one, prairie poetry has to look one way. Number two, that everything about the East Coast is going to be about fishing villages, etc. So it's very easy to start to make those categories very rigid. And what if you are a contemporary poet living in Saskatchewan and you are not writing about the windswept prairies? What if you're writing about something more urban? What if you are writing from inside a tradition that doesn't especially favor the long narrative poem, the way this idea of a prairie poetry, mid-century prairie poetry seemed to? So I think what is not a new idea of locality and sense of place, but maybe a reinvigorated, let's say, sense of place where people are very interested in writing the hyperlocal and what it means to live within a kind of history that exists in the hyperlocal,
Mhm.
right? And so that I think is a more expansive way to go. That by getting smaller in some ways, we get larger, right? So there's more room for everyone to write about poetry. And I'm thinking of things like I just taught Laurie D. Graham's Fast Commute. And she wrote about what it's like to live in a kind of um, satellite city in northwestern Ontario and to always be on a bus going to Toronto to do business and leaving Toronto to go back to, you know, um, Kitchener Waterloo or London or Guelph or Hamilton, etc.
Right.
And I think similar sorts of poetry could be written, from all over the country. So she's exemplary in how she folds in history and how she, particularly the history of what it's like to be a settler on these lands, and thinking about Indigenous history and how to be responsible to and responsive to Indigenous histories, and also just the history of industry and capitalism and her own migrant family, and how all of that mixes in a kind of consideration of what it means to be here.
Hmm.
So that's what I'm really excited about when I'm talking about like a sense of place in poetry, right?
Yeah.
That it cuts a very wide swath through these big questions that um, are existential on the one hand and also call into question our assumptions on the other.
Right. Perfect. So you've articulated a pretty deep concern over the teaching of poetry in the sense that there seems to be this kind of struggle to not struggle, but attention to make sure that it stays a thing that's being taught. That if there wasn't this attention being paid to it, that it just would sort of be taught less. Can you speculate a little bit on that? Like, why is poetry seemingly getting lost in the shuffle in academia?
Mm. Well, I understand that the novel is kind of the genre of our time,
Mm.
but such things are passing. Poetry was au courant for hundreds of years. It's what people thought literature was until the 18th century when fiction, and that is very late in the history of the world for all of a sudden fiction was a thing when. In Western literature, when Samuel Johnson wrote Pamela, so it seems very late, right?
Hmm.
It's 18 trying to think. It's the latter half of the of pardon me. It's the latter half of the 18th century, so it'd be like 1764,
Right.
right? And so all of a sudden, people were into these fictional narratives that were not rendered as Homer did in the Odyssey, right? In these long verses.
Hmm.
Um, so anyway, I'm on and on about the popularity of the novel, but what I want to say is that undergraduate students in most of our universities, need someone to be an advocate for poetry. They also need someone to be an advocate for drama, which is also being taught a lot less.
Hmm.
However, I'm not here to to plump for drama so much.
Right.
Although
There's only
I would
so much
have,
you can do.
yeah,
Yeah.
I would happily teach a course in poetry and drama. Or I mean, I think it'd be even better to have a course in fiction and drama and talk about how they're very different forms and they do different things, right?
Mhm.
That's me not wanting to give up my poetry time, quite frankly.
Yes.
But so I don't really know why they're getting minimized, other than the fact that fiction seems to be kind of an amorphous blob that will take up all the room that we give it,
Hmm.
right? And who knows whether that's people yielding, whether it's a vicious circle that our faculties yielding to student to express student wants, and when if the students say, we'd rather have more short fiction and novels, but are they asking for that because their encounters with poetry are limited,
Hmm.
right? And so they don't know that they can ask for poetry, right? They don't know that they can advocate for more work that engages with language in that way.
Right.
And that's what I always find in when I teach it. People say, "I didn't know you could do this with language. I didn't know this was a thing," right? In student speak. And I think, yeah, it's totally a thing. It's a several thousand-year-old thing,
Right.
right?
Well, then I guess we have to look at the secondary level of instruction. I guess if that's an experience that's happening, but yeah. Do you think more broadly, this perception in with the humanities in general that it's taking a backseat to the sciences and more of a I guess career focused educational emphasis, poetry may be kind of falling victim to that as well.
Yeah, I think that's true.
Mhm.
And I think the denigration of all forms of all genres of literature,
Yeah.
is definitely happening. But of course, what we always say in the humanities, particularly about the humanities that involve any kind of close reading of text, is that it teaches you to be suspicious of the
Yeah.
manipulation of language. It
Mm.
teaches you critical thinking, and it teaches you that 10 people are going to read a single text 10 different ways, which, if we're really thinking about commodifying these kinds of skills, is very handy anywhere in any job that you go to that where the written word matters,
Mm-hmm.
right? Uh, I mean, even if we're talking about things like advertising, right? It matters the way things are written on the page, that the word choice matters. It's not arbitrary,
Right.
right?
Yeah.
And this is what I always say to the students, that their critical thought is being tested every time they read something and every time they make assumptions about what they see in the page, and every time they don't push to question their own assumptions and say, no, no, really, what is going on with this word choice? Why did someone choose this word and not another? They could
Mm-hmm.
have chosen any any word in the world, because it's their blank page and they can do that, but they chose this one, and why?
Exactly. Absolutely. Um, I did want to circle back to the Laurier Poetry Series a little bit, and you did talk a little bit about this in the sense that the series has been developed to help faculty teach poetry. But I'm wondering if you can get into a little bit more detail on that in terms of the structure of the books and the scholarly content that does go into those.
Yes, the editors that we choose as volume editors
Hmm.
are almost always people who have an extensive experience of working with these poems. So they're in the best position possible to say, here's why you should read this poet. Here's why you should use this textbook as an appetizer plate, where you're going to get a little bit from, say, the 5 or 6 books that they've published, and you should seek out those books, right? And sometimes you have to go to libraries because, of course, they're out of print, but they're very much worth pursuing,
Hmm.
right? And also, I think too that it's a good argument to suggest to um, publishers that publish volumes of poetry that their work isn't for naught. We're out here reading it. We're out here supporting it and saying, yes, more books by this poet, please.
Yeah.
Right. And that's certainly what we're doing as we're trying to, as I said, we've looked at capturing one generation, and I'm thinking that we're starting to skew a little younger in the generally in the poets that we're to asking for these selected volumes for.
Hmm.
And that's a little different because these, in some instances, these are poets that are still actively publishing. And we need to say to their publishers that we're working together on this. We're working together to disseminate this poet's work.
Yeah, exactly. And I assume, I guess that, and this might be illustrated in the introductions that the volume editor writes, that the process of selecting that poet's poems for that volume, there must be either a through line or some sort of description about why those particular poems were chosen.
Yeah, definitely. And it depends on the poet, right?
Mm,
Sometimes, people have a very natural through line in their work, and
yeah,
sometimes they take up completely different projects per book. And so the volume editor can definitely address
yeah,
that, the third section of this volume sees a departure from the beginning of that poet's career. And
yeah.
we also ask the poets themselves. They can write their after essay on any aspect of their writing life that they wish.
Mm,
They can address critical comparisons of their poetry. They can talk about their influences. They can do anything. But if they want to say, I really want to talk about how I have developed my style over the years and compare them and look at particular books, they can do that as well. We certainly welcome that.
hmm. Good. So I'm curious, if you encourage your students to get out and experience poetry as well, attend readings and so on. And then how does that support a student's learning process? And I guess it also helps, there's a special interest there maybe in making sure poets are supported during, their appearances.
For sure. Now we are just in a little bit of a lull in terms of that. We used to have a very, very strong slam poetry scene here.
Mm,
And that, I had nothing to do with, except that I would often encourage students who wanted more of that kind of work to say, go and listen to what your contemporaries are writing. It happens, every Tuesday at this place. I won't be there looking over your shoulder. You can just go and enjoy. And we also used to have a literary reading series here that is just ended, called Balderdash. And Balderdash is now being run in Toronto by its founder, but it was here for a number of years. And I would say things like, if you don't want to be in a classroom, but just want to sort of close your eyes and listen to someone read poetry, this is a great thing to come to. And also, I sort of came up in the poetry world going to a weekly series in Toronto every week. Just to listen, right? Because it was, I think it was like a $5 entry fee. You sat at a table and you listened to a ton of people. And I just wanted to hear what people were writing about, right? And eventually I started joining the open mics and etc. right? And this is how you get brave. This is how you make your art public.
Right.
Is at first you're an audience. And you say, okay, what are these people doing? And then you go, hey, I think I could do a little bit of that.
Yeah.
And then you do more and you do more. So, and it's really important too that I think beginner artists, whether they're, our undergraduate students or anyone in the community, doesn't feel alone, right? Feels like, okay, this person doesn't write exactly like I would, but look at them up there reciting. That's interesting.
Right.
Right. And then the other thing is you meet people in the audience, right? You have to sit beside someone, maybe exchange a few words, and then all of a sudden community grows, right? But you have to be brave. You have to actually go.
Yeah.
Right. And it's been, I don't know. I'm of two minds. It's been good. With pandemic restrictions that Zoom has afforded us so many great literary events that you don't have to leave your house for. But I too wonder if that has kind of spoiled us in that we're expecting Claudia Rankine to be available at the drop of a hat, whereas before I used to have to drive 2 hours to see Claudia Rankine.
Yeah.
And in her she has an upcoming event in Toronto, and I would gladly do it because it was that was what, if I wanted to hear her speak, that was the price. Was 2 hours, was 4 hours driving time. And I go, yeah, I'll pay that price. And now it's actually harder to get students out to events because they assume that they can look at their Zoom screen and see the authors they want. And they're not wrong, right? They're not wrong. But there is something about a live event.
Absolutely.
There is something about an in-person event.
You just heard from Dr. Tanis MacDonald. Tanis is an associate professor at Wilfrid Laurier University, editor of the Laurier Poetry Series, and author of several books, including her most recent, Straggle, Adventures in Walking While Female. Join us next week as we examine the appeal of poetry to younger students, Tanis's advocacy of Canadian poets, and what it means to practice your art no matter where you live. This 4-part series is brought to you with support from Wilfrid Laurier University Press.
But first, it has a concern with defining this idea of the big city. What is the big city? What is the mid-sized cities? What is the small city? And there's all kinds of factors go into that. I'm less interested in finding a single definition for that than asking the question that my students asked of me. So if I want to pursue art for a living, do I have to move to Toronto or Montreal or Vancouver? And I said, well, you can, but that doesn't have to be your only choice.
As always, underwriting opportunities for the Authority File podcast are directed by Choice's advertising manager, Pam Marino, and all of our episodes are produced and edited by Choice's digital media producer, Sabrina Kofer, with support from digital media assistant, Ashley Roy. That's all for this week. Thanks for joining us.